I'm Stephen Cook from the Council on Foreign Relations, and I'm moderating this session on the hard questions in the Middle East. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me first introduce our panel, and then we'll get down to business. To my immediate right, I think physically and politically, is my good colleague and friend Elliot Abrams from the Council on Foreign Relations. Elliot has long experience in both inside the U.S. government as well as the policy community. Most recently, he served as Deputy National Security Advisor to President George W. Bush. Before that, he served in the Reagan administration. And in between has been a prolific writer and important voice on American foreign policy debates. To Elliot's right is Ambassador Yusuf Otaiba from the United Arab Emirates, who I think everyone in Washington can agree is the most influential ambassador in Washington, D.C. in at least a generation, maybe more. I'm also very proud to call Yusuf a good friend of mine. Next to Yusuf is Dennis Ross, currently of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Dennis, like Elliot, has a long career in government service. I think his service goes back to the Reagan administration, then George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton. He sat out George W. Bush to write a number of important works about the peace process, and most recently worked for President Obama, both at the State Department as well as the White House. And then finally is my colleague from the Council on Foreign Relations, Robert Danin, who's also had a long and distinguished career in the U.S. government in various guises at the State Department. Most recently, though, his job was the quartet coordinator in Jerusalem, working directly for Tony Blair in helping to forge peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Thank you all, gentlemen. Let me start with you, Dennis. President, during your time at the State Department and the White House with President Obama, you were responsible for Iran policy. And although the JCPOA, otherwise known as the Iran nuclear deal, was signed after your tenure, President Trump has recently decided that he's going to decertify the deal, but not break the deal. He's going to send it to Congress. First, are the president's actions wise? Is this warranted? Some of the commentary is he's just doing this because this was an agreement that was signed by President Obama. And as a quick follow-up to that, is there a better deal to be had?
Well, thanks for the easy question.
This is the Middle East, Dan. You're not going to get away with it.
Look, I would say I actually start off as an arms control negotiator. And if there's one thing you can say about any arms control agreement, it's always going to have flaws built into it. It's going to have limitations built into it. This is no different than that. In the first term, when I was shaping our policy, I envisioned a different kind of an agreement if there was going to be an agreement. I envisioned an agreement where we would make as our very last concession Iran being able to do enrichment, but at a very small scale, where the overall nuclear infrastructure would be so small that that in itself would demonstrate the intent not to pursue weapons. That's not the agreement that ultimately emerged. So there is a reason to be concerned about the content of the agreement. You ask a question, though, that's a very important one. Is there a better agreement out there? Clearly, none of the other members of the Permanent 5+1 who negotiated this along with the United States believe there is a better agreement out there. However, at the same time, while they're all making it clear, especially the Europeans, our allies are making it clear they will not renegotiate the JCPOA, you also have the president of France who's saying, well, there should be some supplemental agreements that are negotiated that deal with some of the real limitations here. Key restrictions on the Iranian nuclear program in terms of what they can enrich to what level, not being able to do nuclear reprocessing. These are restrictions that expire in the year 2030. And the president of France is saying, well, we ought to negotiate on that. In effect, one of the things that the president has done by not certifying, and you can debate whether this was the best way to get others to realize that maybe something should be done, they are paying more attention to this than they would have otherwise. And as a result, there is a kind of leverage that exists. The leverage that exists is a function of no one wanting us to walk away from the deal, and therefore they have to find a way to address our concerns. Now, the nub of this is that there is a fine balance to be struck. Our European allies in particular face their own political constraints. It's not diplomatic understatement to say that the President of the United States is not particularly popular in the UK, in France, or in Germany, and that does affect those political leaders and how much they can respond to what the President is pushing. If he looks like this is just an excuse to walk away from the deal, he's going to find it very difficult to make progress with them. If, in fact, he demonstrates, and I will say, if you listen to the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, our ambassador to the UN over the weekend, the tone that they conveyed was different than the tone that he offered. I happened to be watching his speech on Friday with a senior European ambassador who will remain nameless, and I can tell you when he and I, before the speech, discussed some of the substance, I found him actually pretty responsive. When he watched the speech, he reacted very negatively to the tone. So the administration, I think, is going to have to find a way to frame the issues the right way, and I've made a suggestion in print already. I think one thing that would help the administration would be to appoint a senior envoy from the outside who would be seen as being credible, who would immediately give the Europeans a kind of explanation that say, look, the administration, this is proof the administration means what they say, that they want to discuss this, they want to negotiate this, they'll take our concerns into account, and there's not a precipitous rush to leave this deal. And I think that if that's the way this is pursued, we may yet find that even if we can't necessarily reach agreements quickly, we can create a set of guidelines that can begin to create a new set of standards that the Iranians won't be able to ignore. Again, and I'll conclude with this, in the first term of the Obama administration, the Iranians repeatedly told us in the meetings that were taking place as part of the 5+1 that they would never negotiate on their nuclear program so long as they were under sanctions. And what we did was we tripled down on the sanctions. And guess what? They negotiated. And at the same time, we didn't corner them, we left them a way out. If the approach is one where we can demonstrate that we can create an international consensus that isolates them, and that's going to be the challenge, then the potential to affect the Iranian behavior goes up. It doesn't go down.
Great. Rob, I was, when I was toying with what questions to ask everybody, I was going to ask you a Syria question, but I decided to ask you an easier question. While the decertification was going on, Hamas and Fatah struck a unity deal. Why is this deal different from all other deals that they've had over the years? And importantly, what are the consequences of failure of this particular unity deal between Hamas and Fatah?
Well, thank you. And thank you for this wonderful opportunity to be with all of my friends. Not all of my friends, but with a panel in which everyone on the panel is a friend. I've worked with Dennis at the State Department, Elliot at the White House, and Stephen at CFR, and Yusuf in Washington more broadly. So it's wonderful to be here. First, just I guess a bit of context in a nod to Dennis. What has been reached really is an affirmation of a pre-existing agreement. To the 2011 Cairo Agreement has been resuscitated. Keep in mind, since 2007, there have been about a half a dozen efforts at reconciliation. So, first, what's the problem, and what's the issue? I mean, the real issue is the following. The Palestinian people, the people of Gaza, the people of the West Bank want unity. They do not like this division in which they cannot see each other. They cannot have contact with one another. But in reality, the leadership sees this as the least bad alternative. Or put another way, they want unity, but they want unity on their own terms. And so ever since, there's been a difficulty in reaching an agreement because both sides want unity, but neither side wants to pay the price for what it would really take. So why is this different now? Why has resuscitating the 2011 agreement why is it different now? I would say it's different because the context has changed so dramatically, both within the Palestinian arena and more broadly in the region. So on the Palestinian front, you have really a dramatic change in which there is a generational shift taking place. We know Mahmoud Abbas is 82 years old and is, the actuary tables will do their work. And so you have Palestinian politics lining itself up in preparation for that day. So you're seeing a shift to a younger generation of Palestinians, not necessarily more moderate or more hardline, but different. And that reflects then a second factor, which is a shift in the center of gravity of Palestinian politics from what has traditionally been known as the outsiders to the insiders. And more immediately, because you're seeing this happen within Hamas. And so what happened with the shift from Khalid Mashal to Hania is a shift really from an outside leadership to a Gaza-based leadership, at the same time that the military wing has elected Yahya Sinwar. So you now have both wings of Hamas inside Gaza. And that means their orientation is different. While Mashal was based in Doha, trying to work on renegotiating the platform for 4 years of the Hamas's strategy, Sinwar and Hania are focused on the day-to-day issues that Gaza is facing. And what has happened is, especially because after they came to power, and this shift took place in Hamas earlier this year, Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, really started to squeeze even harder Gaza, withholding remittances, withholding salary payments. And the squeeze is really being felt quite badly. And this has put a lot of pressure on the inside. And so if you have a leadership on the ground who are much more in tune with the needs of the people, their orientation is much more focused on trying to get change on the ground rather than for Khalid Mashal, who's sitting in Doha in a nice hotel working on the what has changed is the focus. And this leads to the third and perhaps the most important shift, which is the return of Egypt to playing a leading role as the arbiter and the sort of player within Palestinian politics. And this is really significant, and it's also, there's a bit of historical irony here, because keep in mind, from 1948 to 1968, let's say, the Arab states took the lead in Palestinian politics. From the 48 war through 67, the basic message in inter-Arab politics was, leave it to us, Palestinians. You failed to defeat the Zionists in Palestine. We will liberate you. The PLO rose to basically say, no, we're going to take back Palestinian politics from the Arab states. You've delivered nothing for us. We're in control. And the second phase, really, from 68 through Oslo, has been about the Palestinian leadership, the Palestinian national movement trying to assert itself, trying to develop a positive program, ultimately to build a state. What we're seeing is the return of the Arab states to the center of Palestinian politics, such that what has happened now, to get back to what is happening immediately, is Egypt has said, we want Gaza not to blow up. We are willing to make some sort of amends tactically with a very hurting Hamas leadership who ideologically it opposes, but tactically sees as important because there are other threats that are even greater, such as jihadists in Sinai. And so Egypt wants Hamas to take responsibility for keeping things quiet and help in the fight in Sinai. And at the same time, it really doesn't hold much truck for the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah. So the factors have changed, the dynamics have changed. There is now a greater impetus. So things have changed dramatically. That all said, I'd say the mood today when you talk to Palestinians is still one of an expectation that this will fail, but a sense of, something's a little different this time. And I liken what is happening now between the two leaderships to what has traditionally been the game, and I know we'll get to this in a bit, between Israelis and Palestinians. When we've worked in government at times and have tried to move the sides, you say to each one, okay, I know you don't want to make this concession, but just don't, do it because you don't want to be blamed for when this thing goes bad. And in a lot of ways, what's happening now is the Palestinian leadership, each of them, I'd say, attentive to the desire on the street for there to be unity, is playing along because they know they need it for legitimacy, for popularity purposes. Egypt is putting pressure to try to move this process forward, but neither side ultimately really is still willing to pay the price, and neither wants to be blamed.
Great, thanks. Elliot, President Trump went to Saudi Arabia in late May. And in addition to doing the sword dance and touching the orb, the gift that will keep on giving, he essentially repudiated the freedom agenda, which was the centerpiece of George W. Bush's policies in the Middle East. He said that the era of telling people in the Middle East how they're going to live, what their society should look like, is over. Why was this, from your perspective, not a wise move? Why is democracy promotion a good thing?
Pardon me. Well, first, I think it's not clear that that is American policy, because I was struck by the fact that the president did, as you said, but then. We withhold $195 million in aid to Egypt and take away $95 million more. Then the president gives a speech about Afghanistan in which, once again, he says the same thing. The era in which we're invading countries to turn them into nation building is over. But in the same speech, he says, now the Afghan government's got to reform. It's got to have political reforms. Well, what's that? That's, in my view, nation building. So I think the policy is actually less coherent and firm in saying that's all over. Now, I think where this comes from is pretty clear. It comes from fatigue, particularly having to do with the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. And the sense on the part of a lot of Americans, which the president whom the president speaks for, this stuff is endless. It costs thousands of American lives. It costs $1 trillion, and we're tired of it. My own view is that we are tired of it, but I don't think what we were doing in Afghanistan and Iraq was initially nation building. We didn't invade them in order to achieve that goal. And I do think we'll come back to it, because I think we'll find, let me use a word that is less emotive than nation building or democracy. If governments are not legitimate, they're not going to be stable. The only way they're going to stay in power is brute force. And even those governments, as we saw in the Soviet Union, ultimately fail. There are various sources of legitimacy. I would suggest 3. Monarchic legitimacy, which we see in many parts of the Middle East, and it is not an accident. It is not a coincidence that none of the monarchies fell in the Arab Spring, because they had legitimacy, varying degrees, but they had legitimacy. Second, alternatively, performance legitimacy. That is where people in the country say, well, we really actually have a very effective and efficient government. Third, democracy. And needless to say, if you don't have democratic legitimacy or performance legitimacy or monarchical legitimacy, then you are ruling by brute force. And that is what happened, I would say, in Libya, in Egypt, in Syria, in Yemen. Because Yusuf is sitting here, I'll note, Edelman Worldwide does a survey every year asking people in 100 different countries, what do you think of your government? And Singapore, UAE, generally rate right at the top, in the sense that people in the country say, this is a pretty good government. It's a pretty effective government. We're pretty happy with this government. So I think ultimately we're going to come back to these questions, because people in those countries, and I think this is a permanent change from the Arab Spring, people in those countries are demanding more from their governments. They're not willing to accept endless corruption, incompetence, repression, all combined.
Well, it suggests to me perhaps we should have some monarchy promotion here in the United States, at least. Yusuf, I was going to start out with the situation between your government and Qatar and the isolation of Qatar in the Gulf. But I can't not ask you about what's happening in northern Iraq. The Kurdistan regional government has been attacked by the central government of Iraq with Iraqi security forces, as well as in coordination with forces backed by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. They have retaken the city of Kirkuk. What is the reaction from your government and the Gulf? I realize you only speak for your government, but what is the reaction? This seems to me as another win for the Iranians in the region. What's the response?
So first, thank you for having me. Thank you to Richard and everybody at the Octavian Report. All my fellow panelists are much, much smarter than me, so please, I urge you to listen to them.
Let's do an IQ test.
I think on northern Iraq, we find ourselves in very good company where we are in a pretty awkward, precarious position, where on one hand, no one wants to see the disintegration of yet another Arab country, especially at a time like this, at a phase like this. But on the other hand, the Kurds, who have been living on this fault line with Iraq from the days of 1990 when Saddam was in office, and what happened to the Kurds after Desert Storm, the tensions with whoever was in power in Iraq have been, well documented. They have been arguably the most effective fighting force against Daesh for the last several years, and they have a long list of serious and valid grievances from the central government. And I remember having conversations with you before about, will this ultimately happen? Will this referendum ever take place? And here we are, several days after the referendum, and the Iraqi government takes a hard line that now Iran has exploited. Iran has once again, true to form, has taken an opportunity and pushed with IRGC forces, with PMF forces, and injected itself into another fault line within our region. And so if this was a completely internal political issue between the Iraqi central government and the Kurds, I would say, we probably have a fair chance of resolving it if we sit down. But with Iranian intervention, with Iranian exploitation of this, I am more skeptical that this gets resolved peacefully. And so I actually would turn the question back to you, since you're the resident expert, and say, forecast 6 months out. Where are we from U.S. policy, from Gulf policy? Where is the central government of Iraq versus the Kurds 6 months from now?
Great, thanks for the answer. I have a second round of questions, but we're starting to run out of time, so I wanted to open it to the audience who have an opportunity to ask questions of these accomplished Middle East policymakers and analysts. Right here in the front.
So the central conflict in the Middle East seems to be centered around two countries, at least among the Arab countries. It seems to be between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and they've kind of been fighting a bunch of proxy wars for the past 50 years. And I was wondering where the UAE folds into that. Are you more aligned with the Sunni Saudis or the Shia Iranians who seem to be fighting all these proxy wars in different nations?
So I would answer this by simply saying, I think it's not just Sunni versus Shia. I think that would be far too simplistic and easy way for us to get out of looking at the various other challenges that go along with it. I would ask you to think about it from this perspective. This is a competition between Arabs and Persians. And it's a battle over identity, it's a battle over dominance, it's a battle over history, it's a battle over a variety of different things that then sort of mandate itself or take the form that you see today, and then we think it's just Sunni versus Shia. If it was Sunni versus Shia, there would be problems all over the Middle East, and especially in countries that have more of a split between the two. I think what you're describing is a clash or a competition between whose version and who gets more control over their part of the world. The issue that we have suffered from for a very long time is Iranian intervention in our part of the world. 20 years ago, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, were managed by Arabs. Today, those three capitals, admittedly, are managed by Tehran. And so I think what we worry about is more Iranian influence and dominance in what is essentially Arab Middle East. And our concerns with not just the JCPOA, but what Iranian behavior following the JCPOA is they're now more legitimate and they're now more powerful and they now have more money to continue what they've been doing for the last several years. And Kirkuk, as Stephen just pointed out, is a perfect example of that expansionist, legitimized Iran taking advantage of the rest of the Middle East.
Yusuf, you gave me an opening here. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to push you a little bit on this. What was the primary motivating factor in isolating Qatar in the GCC? Was it the Qatari relationship with Iran? Was it the Qatari relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood? Was it the Qatari relationship with other extremist groups? And if it was about Iran, doesn't, for example, the UAE itself have some questions it has to answer, given the banks in Dubai's financial relationship with the actors in Iran as well?
So the short answer is all the above. That's the main reason,
So as I say,
all of them.
excellent ambassador, excellent diplomat.
But you can break it down into two categories. One is support for terrorism and extremism. And I would, I know my fellow panelists pretty well. I don't think any person on this panel could safely look at the audience on the record and say, no, Qatar does not support extremist groups. No, Qatar has not supported terrorist groups. We all know they have. We've all looked the other way. And we finally just said, we'll make our peace with it. We've said we've had enough. You cannot continue to do this while being a member of the club. Right? The second part, which doesn't get as much attention in the West because it's more domestic, is interference in our domestic affairs. Whether it's in the UAE, Saudi, Egypt, Bahrain, Qatar has a long history of supporting groups that undermine the stability of those countries, of taking dissidents and giving them Qatari nationality, of taking them and putting them on Qatari TV. And so finally, those two issues have reached a point where all four countries have said, we've had enough. And it's not to isolate, and it's not to punish. It's simply to say, you cannot be part of our group, you cannot be part of the team while you are spending money and spending so much effort in trying to undermine us and our stability. If you prioritize your relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood, with Hamas, with the Taliban, with the IRGC, if those relationships are more important to Qatar than their relationship with Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the UAE, so be it. Good luck. God bless you, and we wish you the best future possible. But what we're saying is you cannot be allied with all of them and be part of our team at the same time. And just think of the US-Cuba analogy. At one point, the US and Cuba did not have a relationship because of a fundamental philosophical difference of view. We have the same thing with Qatar. And so the question is, does Qatar want to come back into the fold with the GCC and its neighbors? Is their relationship with Saudi Arabia and Egypt and us more important to it than its relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood? And that's a question only they can answer.
Great, thank you. You all right? Sir.
I'm kind of amazed that a panel on the Middle East has so far not once mentioned Israel. And has strictly focused on sort of internal or Arab versus Persian problems in Iraq with the Kurds, problems of course in Syria, problems internally among the Palestinians. So is this the positive canary in the coal mine that says that Israel is essentially a problem that has been separated and in some way is on its way to some kind of on-the-ground solution? Or is it saying Israel and the Palestinians are such a tough nut that we are simply throwing up our hands and going to let it play out in its own way? So there you have it.
I think every member of the panel is equipped to answer that question. So why don't we go down the line, starting with Rob, to offer perhaps your perspective on why this is not prioritized, or it doesn't seem to be prioritized any longer.
Well, first and foremost, I mean, you have had a fundamental shift in the Middle East from a time at which the Arab-Israeli conflict had been the central fault line that could have brought the United States and the Soviet Union to nuclear alert. It just isn't play that role anymore. It has been shrunk to size. It is now largely a conflict between Israel and the Palestinians over the territory between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. That said, I think it would be a mistake to flip 180 degrees the other way and say it is therefore unimportant and therefore can be just ignored for two really basic reasons. I mean, first, in a sense, from an Israeli point of view, its borders and its role in the region, its role in the world has not been concretized, and that is because of the 100-plus year ongoing dispute over the Holy Land between Jews and Arabs in the Holy Land. From a United States point of view, it's important because the cause of Palestine, however diminished it has become, it still has resonance in the Arab world, and it still can be mobilized. And we've come close a few times recently when there's violence on the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, the symbol of Jerusalem. It is still a factor. Why is it, and I'll let Yusuf say, but why is it Arab states that may want to make peace with Israel can't or won't? Because the Palestinian cause still has saliency amongst their people. And so why pay that price and put their regimes further under stress for a cause that it still has popularity in some parts of their world? So the point is, the Palestinian cause has not gone away. And at the end of the day, if you care about the future of Israel, then there is a lot, fundamental questions on, that are inextricably linked to its relationship to peace and peace with its neighbors.
Dennis, you have thoughts on this?
I do. I very much agree with Rob's analysis. I guess I would add a couple of thoughts. Number one, because there are other more immediate threats right now. You listen to Yusuf talk about how the UAE sees things. Well, the UAE is not unique in that respect. And Iran, the fact is, Iran does have a desire to dominate the region. It has a desire basically to create a kind of hegemony. It wants to see the U.S. out of the area. It wants to put itself in a position where it can pretty much dictate to all the local governments what they're going to do, and if they don't, then they can subvert them. Well, that has a way of concentrating the mind, and that puts a premium on the Iranian threat for most of the Arab states. Others will also see threats, again, from, like in the Egyptian case, their main preoccupation is with threats that are within the Sinai coming from jihadi types of groups. That said, this issue doesn't go away. And because it doesn't go away, and because, I'll say it slightly differently than Rob, but it means the same thing, the cause of Palestine still resonates because it's still seen through a lens of a source of injustice. And so long as that source of injustice isn't addressed, it will put those governments that might like to do things with the Israelis in the open, it'll put them somewhat on the defensive and puts them in a position where they don't want the Iranians, as an example, to try to exploit this issue against them or to try to mobilize their public against them. So it's not the main priority because there are other threats that are seen as much more profound and much more direct and much more existential. And there's also an interesting perception within the region, which we are beginning to see, by the way, in polls for the first time. Increasingly, there's been a series of polls that have just been done that show in many Arab states, you're seeing as much of a quarter of the population who say, look, even if there isn't peace with Israel, maybe we should be doing things with them. Yeah. You've never seen that before. And that also suggests to me that there's probably more change taking place psychologically than the polls are capturing right now. So that also suggests that there may well be something more that can be done here. And it reflects also something that many of us have felt for a long time. This conflict is not the centerpiece of the region, but it can't be ignored. And by the way, if you're a supporter of Israel, the one thing you don't want to see is Israel become a binational state. If nothing is done on this issue, if you simply let the current trends continue as they are, Israel will become a binational state. So the fact is there's a reason to have an interest in it, particularly if you want to take advantage of what is the convergence of strategic interests that exists today between Israel and frankly, almost all of the Sunni Arab states.
Yusuf, your government has been rumored, I don't want you to give anything away, rumored to be one of those that has either done more or would like to do more with Israel. How do you respond to the question? Is it because there are other issues, or it's too hard to resolve the conflict and you're just moving on?
So both Robert and Dennis's analysis is exactly right. This has been a festering core issue for the region for a very long time, and it's very emotional. You know, people in the Middle East, even the ones who don't have daily interaction with Palestine or Israel, feel like this is something that's been going on for 60 years, this is something we need to resolve, this something is not fair. And so there's this tendency to look at the Palestinian issue as a broader Arab emotional issue that we all need to work on to fix it. And there's definitely movement towards, I think in the last few months, people are starting to feel more optimistic about it. Everything else that's been going on, ISIS, Iran, Syria, Libya, Yemen, has taken away some of the attention and people's ability to focus on this problem that has been stalemated for a very long time. Doesn't mean we should ignore it. Doesn't mean we should put it on the back burner. It actually means we should use every opportunity we can. But in answer to your question about Israel, I think there's a variety of factors that have made us realize that there are certain alignments on policies when it comes to Israel. We look at threats the same way. We see extremism the same way. We see Iran the same way. We see stability of important Arab countries the same way. So there's this understanding that, you know, there are things we can work on. But I remember a friend of mine in Congress said this comment to me. She said, all politics is local. Palestinian is still a local issue for Arabs. We cannot be overt in our relationship with Israel. And no country can until there's progress on the Palestinian track. The Palestinian track is very important for us. If anything, that should be the opportunity. That should be the window. The Arab Peace Initiative is built around that concept. So I think there's an opportunity for Israel to develop and normalize relationships with a variety of Arab countries, provided there's progress on the Palestinian track.
I'll let you get the last word on this and on our panel, so I know that's a place you like to be, so please.
You know, in 2009 or 10, Jim Jones, National Security Advisor, at the time said in his speech, if God came down to earth and said to President Obama, you get one wish, you can solve one world problem, only one, I'm sure, General Jones said, that Obama would ask God to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I was thinking, listening to your question, that even for Jim Jones and Barack Obama, you know, if he came down now, they'd probably say, hold on, maybe North Korea this time.
Can I just make one closing comment? We've been here for almost 40 minutes, and we've talked about every problem there is in the Middle East, from Palestine to Iran to ISIS. But what I would urge folks in the audience to look at the positive side of the ledger, to look at the opportunities that exist in the Middle East today, to look at the actual potential that we see. I mean, I was reading the local press in the UAE a couple weeks ago, and the headline was, applications are coming out for the first UAE astronaut to go to space. We are talking about innovation. We're improving the quality of education. We have double the number of women studying STEM in the UAE, double the number of US and Germany, double the percentage. Our female graduate rates are about 80%. Our literacy rate is 97%. The economy is doing great despite oil prices at $50 a barrel. So while we're up here discussing all these problems, there's a lot of good stuff going on in the Middle East, and I think we should be aware of it, and we should encourage it and promote it and try to stabilize the positive progress that we see in places in the Middle East today.
Thanks, Yusuf. Usually after a Middle East panel, people are running for the alcohol or the sharp objects. So I'm glad you intervened before I ended it. Please join me in thanking Elliot, Yusuf, Dennis, and Robert. Thank you very much.